I am Nancy Merrill Sullivan. I am the Outreach Manager for Arundel Rivers Federation, and I am pleased to present our State of the Rivers annual report card. It is a special honor this year because I actually helped to collect the data and analyze the data. Uh, but first, let me tell you a couple things about Arundel Rivers Federation. We are a nonprofit, and our mission is to protect, restore, and preserve the South, West, and Road rivers, all of which are immediately south of Annapolis, Maryland. We do this by installing large scale restoration projects. We have done 90 of them in our 20-year history, and these help to clean and filter the water in the streams before they get to the tidal waters. The other thing we do is we regularly test the quality of the water and make sure we understand where the pollution is coming from. And in the summertime, we check to make sure it's safe to swim. Finally, we advocate for stronger environmental laws and better enforcement of those laws. So let me now turn it over to Jesse Iliff, the Southwest and Road Riverkeeper, to explain the data. Thanks.
Now, the moment we've all been waiting for, where weekly monitoring for 5 months culminates in our 2020 report card scores. Bottom line is, things were solid, not great, but not terrible in all 3 rivers. We had a C+ in the south, a C in the Road River, and a C in the west. Now, what goes into that? Going from the top, we have bottom pH, which was solid across the board with A+ in the south and the road and an A in the West River. Although the scores actually all went down from 2019. And part of the reason for that was early spring algal blooms, which tend to drive up pH levels and outside of acceptable ranges. Bacteria were also solid. We had A's across the board, slightly worsened scores in the south, a little bit better in the road, and a little bit worse in the west. Part of the picture for the Road River is changed community participation in our Operation Clearwater program, which samples bacteria during the summer at swimming beaches. The pandemic changed some of the community participation, and so we didn't go to all the same stops in the Road River as we had in 2019. Dissolved oxygen was also fairly solid, a B- in the south, B+ in the road, and a B in the West River, although all 3 rivers saw their scores go down in 2020 compared to 2019. Bottom temperature was an interesting story in 2020. The temperature readings increased or improved in the South River, but got worse in the Road and the West River. We'll talk a little bit more about why we believe that is in a second. Water clarity, not too great. Across the board, we've got a D+ in the South River, a D in the Road, and a D- in the West River. Although the clarity levels did improve a little bit from 2019 in the South and the Road rivers. And underwater grasses is the sad story of 2020. There was a decrease in the acreage on the South River, and 2.5 acres of widgeon grass that existed in the Road River disappeared entirely. The West River didn't have any in 2019 and didn't have any again in 2020. Now, I don't want people to be too terribly alarmed about the widgeon grass leaving from the Road River. Widgeon grass is a notoriously boom and bust species of underwater grasses, and so we're holding out hope that it will come back, and it tends to come and go from year to year, so that hope is a fairly sound one. Again, C+ in the South River, a little bit down from 2019. The Road River held steady with a C, and the West River got a little bit worse, but still resulted in a C grade. Part of these scores are a little bit artificially depressed because we got started monitoring later in the season when water is warmer and water quality tends to go down. Now, the reason for the pollution in our rivers and creeks is driven by precipitation. And this graph shows that as precipitation goes up, water clarity tends to go down. Clarity is influenced most by suspended sediments, mostly just dirt, are number one pollutant in all three rivers by volume and by impact. And so when the rain falls hardest, it washes the most into our streams and creeks and drives water clarity down. You see that large bar of precipitation in August and the orange line for clarity going down. But then as the rain tapered off in September and October, water clarity started to tick back up. This graph shows all of our monitoring stations throughout the three rivers. And we always want to keep an eye on where our hot spots of pollution are, where water pollution is worse, and also celebrate where it's best. Unfortunately, the worst stations, 4 out of 5 were in the West River, as you can see on the lower part of the slide. Also, as far upstream as we go in the South River is our main stem 5 station, also saw pretty poor water quality overall. But towards the mouths of the rivers, things improve a great deal. And as you see on the South River, our main stem 1 and main stem 1A stations had very solid water quality, as did the stations off of Camp Wabana in the Road River and in the West River float-free channel. An important and surprising creek that improved a lot in 2020 was Crab Creek, up sort of towards the middle of the South River on the Annapolis Neck. We get these scores by averaging bottom temperature, bottom pH, and dissolved oxygen, and water clarity over the course of our 20-week monitoring season. As I mentioned earlier, all three rivers had a decrease of dissolved oxygen at the bottom of the water column. And that is an important phenomenon because it causes what we call the hypoxic squeeze, where bottom dissolved oxygen levels are so low that fish can't breathe and they become stressed, which drives them towards the top of the water. But unfortunately, the surface temperatures at the top of the water column in summer tend to be higher than fish are able to be in comfortably. And so it causes this sort of squeeze where they need to find that sweet spot in the middle where there's enough dissolved oxygen to breathe, but it's not so hot that they get stressed. The South River, unfortunately, had a persistent dead zone throughout most of the summer. And that is shown here on this slide where you can see the dissolved oxygen average levels in the South River over the course of the monitoring season. Under 3 milligrams per liter of dissolved oxygen is a stressful situation for fish and they can't survive there for very long. That unfortunately persisted from the beginning of June all the way through the beginning of September in the South River, meaning that the bottom part of the water column in the river was not hospitable for fish for most of our monitoring season. So there was a dead zone in the South River for most of our monitoring season. And this is at odds with overall bay improvement. Over the course of the fall, we saw from the Chesapeake Bay program that the bay overall had its smallest dead zone in many years. Unfortunately, that did not extend into the smaller tributaries of the South, West, and Road Rivers, where we saw dissolved oxygen levels overall decreased from 2019 to 2020. It's just another bit of evidence that pollution and water quality are localized issues and require localized solutions. Bottom temperature is important, again, because warm water doesn't hold as much dissolved oxygen as cooler water does. And so the interplay between water temperature and dissolved oxygen plays out a lot in the water column from top to bottom. And warmer bottom water means less dissolved oxygen and exacerbates the hypoxic squeeze phenomenon I just described. You would think that being so close geographically, the South, the West, and the Road Rivers would have very similar temperatures overall. And they do have very similar surface water temperatures, but the bottom water temperatures changed a lot. And part of the reason for that is that the West and Road Rivers are both fairly shallow, with average depths between 5 and 6 feet. The South River, by contrast, is much deeper, which allows some insulation from hot air temperatures as the deeper water can retain its cooler temperature over time. This bar graph shows that the West River was a great deal warmer than the South and the road. Uh, Unfortunately, out of all the 43 stations we monitor, the worst 9 for bottom temperature were all in the West River. The West River also suffered with water clarity. The late season water clarity readings in the West River didn't pick up the way that they did in the South and the road rivers. Generally, towards the end of the season, when temperatures start to cool off, algal activity starts to become diminished and water clarity improves. But as you can see on this graph, we didn't see that over the course of the monitoring season in 2020 for the West River. There are the two rivers on top, the South and the road are those tan and orangish colors, and the West is the red. Now, unfortunately, for most of the season, the 1 meter clarity goal wasn't attained anywhere. But as you can see, towards the end of the season, the road and the South rivers started to improve their clarity a lot, but the West continued to struggle and generally didn't see any water clarity readings greater than 0.7 of a meter over the course of the entire season. So we need to figure out how to get a handle on the clarity problems and the total suspended sediment pollution in the West River if we're going to be able to bring that clarity score up. Thank you so much for tuning in for our report card presentation.